Jerusalem did not fall in a single moment. It collapsed under pressure that had been building for decades, and when it finally burned, the consequences reached far beyond its walls. What was destroyed in 70 AD was not just a city, but a religious and political center that had anchored an entire people, and its fall reshaped the course of history in ways still felt today. Because this was not simply a war between Rome and a rebellious province, it was a clash between imperial control and deeply rooted identity, and neither side was willing to compromise. And when that kind of conflict escalates, it rarely ends in negotiation. It ends in destruction, and Jerusalem would become one of the clearest examples of that pattern. But to understand why Rome chose to destroy the city so completely, we need to go back to the conditions that made conflict inevitable in the first place. Because the fall of Jerusalem was not an accident of war, it was the result of a system that could no longer hold together under pressure. And once that system broke, the consequences would not remain local, they would echo across continents and centuries. Judea was not just another Roman province, it was a land defined by strong religious identity, and that identity shaped how its people responded to foreign rule. Unlike other regions that gradually adapted to Roman customs, many Jews viewed Roman authority as incompatible with their beliefs, creating constant tension beneath the surface. This tension was not only religious, but also political, as Roman governors often ruled harshly, extracting taxes and enforcing order with little sensitivity to local traditions. As a result, resentment built steadily over time, and while it did not immediately lead to open revolt, it created a fragile environment where conflict could easily ignite. When small incidents occurred, they were not isolated. They became symbols of deeper grievances, and each new conflict added fuel to an already unstable situation. By the mid-1st century, this tension had reached a breaking point, and what followed would transform a local rebellion into a full-scale war. In 66 AD, open revolt finally erupted, and Jewish forces initially achieved surprising success against Roman troops, which gave them confidence and momentum. This early success created a dangerous illusion, because it suggested that Rome could be defeated, even though the empire still held overwhelming military power. Rome, however, did not tolerate rebellion lightly, and it responded with a level of force designed not just to win, but to eliminate resistance entirely. The campaign was led by Vespasian, a general known for discipline and efficiency, and his approach reflected Rome's broader strategy of crushing dissent decisively. As Roman forces advanced, they systematically retook territory, isolating rebel strongholds and cutting off supply lines, which weakened resistance over time. This methodical approach ensured that by the time Jerusalem was targeted, it was already surrounded and vulnerable, both militarily and economically. Inside the city, conditions were deteriorating rapidly, and internal divisions among Jewish factions made the situation even worse. Different groups fought not only the Romans, but also each other, and this internal conflict weakened their ability to mount a unified defense. As a result, the city was not just under external siege, it was also collapsing from within, creating a compounded crisis that accelerated its downfall. By the time the Roman army, now led by Titus, reached Jerusalem, the city was already on the brink of catastrophe. The siege that followed was brutal and prolonged, as Roman forces encircled the city, cutting off food and supplies to force surrender through starvation. This tactic was not unusual for Rome, but in Jerusalem it had devastating consequences, as civilians suffered alongside fighters, blurring the line between war and humanitarian crisis. As hunger spread, desperation grew, and the social order within the city began to break down, further weakening any organized resistance. Meanwhile, Roman forces tightened their grip, building siege works and preparing for a final assault that would end the conflict decisively. When the walls were finally breached, the result was not just defeat, it was destruction on a massive scale. The Second Temple, the spiritual heart of Jewish life, was set ablaze, and its destruction marked a turning point that would redefine Judaism itself. Without the temple, traditional forms of worship centered on sacrifice could no longer continue, forcing a transformation toward new religious structures and practices. This shift would eventually shape the development of Rabbinic Judaism, illustrating how destruction can lead to long-term adaptation. But in the immediate aftermath, the focus was not adaptation, it was survival, as thousands were killed and many others enslaved. The city itself was devastated, and what remained was a stark reminder of Rome's power and its willingness to use it without restraint. For Rome, this victory was not just military, it was symbolic, demonstrating that rebellion would be met with overwhelming force. This message was reinforced through monuments like the Arch of Titus, which depicted the spoils of Jerusalem carried into Rome. These images were meant to project dominance, and they served as a warning to other provinces that might consider rebellion. However, the story did not end with the destruction of Jerusalem, because resistance would rise again in the decades that followed. Around 60 years later, another revolt erupted, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, and this time it briefly succeeded in establishing independence. This temporary success showed that the desire for autonomy had not disappeared, but it also set the stage for an even harsher Roman response. Under Emperor Hadrian, Rome moved to suppress the revolt with extreme force, determined to prevent any future uprisings. The result was catastrophic, as entire regions were devastated, and large portions of the population were killed or displaced. This second suppression went beyond military defeat. It aimed to erase the foundations of Jewish identity within the region. Jews were banned from Jerusalem, and the city was rebuilt as a Roman colony, marking a deliberate attempt to reshape its identity. Even the name of the region was changed to Syria Palestina, reflecting Rome's intention to sever the connection between the land and its people. This was not just punishment, it was a strategy of control, designed to prevent future resistance by removing its cultural and geographic roots. As a result, Jewish communities became increasingly dispersed, spreading across different parts of the Roman Empire and beyond. This dispersion, known as the diaspora, would become a defining feature of Jewish history for centuries. Unlike earlier migrations, this was not voluntary movement. It was the outcome of systemic displacement driven by imperial policy. The long-term consequences were profound, as Jewish identity adapted to life without a central homeland or temple. At the same time, the memory of Jerusalem remained central, creating a powerful connection between past and present that endured across generations. This pattern, where a single conflict reshapes identity and geography, can be seen in other parts of history, but few examples are as enduring. Even today, the legacy of these events continues to influence political and cultural dynamics in the region. Modern conflicts often reflect deep historical roots, and understanding those roots helps explain why certain issues remain unresolved. While the world has changed dramatically since the Roman Empire, the underlying dynamics of power, identity, and resistance remain strikingly similar. When a dominant power imposes control without accommodating local identity, the result is often long-term instability rather than lasting peace. Jerusalem's destruction illustrates this pattern clearly, showing how short-term military victories can produce long-term consequences. For Rome, the war ended in victory, but the broader impact extended far beyond its immediate goals. It reshaped religious practice, altered demographic patterns, and created a legacy that continues to resonate. And for the Jewish people, it marked a turning point that transformed their history, identity, and relationship to their homeland. In the end, the war that destroyed Jerusalem did more than change a city. It changed the trajectory of an entire civilization. And its effects remind us that when conflict reaches a certain intensity, the consequences rarely remain contained. If you found this breakdown valuable, consider subscribing, because the next story may explain the world you see today even more than you expect.